On the morning of October 20th, 1805, after days of pelting rain, the storm clouds melted away, replaced by a shining sun. From atop the heights of Mikkelsburg, silhouetted by a massive bonfire, Emperor Napoleon surveyed the approach of a party of Austrians, General Karl Mack and his staff. Less than a month before, Mack had been threatening France itself with invasion. Now, hat in hand, he'd come to surrender his entire command without condition. The Third Coalition had been dealt a crippling blow, and one from which it would fail to recover. It was a staggering reversal of fortunes. Great Britain formed the backbone of the coalescing Third Coalition. At war with France since the fraying of the Treaty of Amiens, Britain offered extensive military support, territorial guarantees, and most importantly, immense subsidies to any European power willing to join the coalition. Their efforts thus far had borne fruit. Sweden joined in late 1804, and then Russia a few months later. Naples, Portugal, the Ottoman Empire, and Prussia sat on the fence, weighing up their options. The Third Coalition was taking shape. Against British gold, Napoleon's promises meant little. Alliance with France all but ensured commercial collapse for coastal states, or the risk of being overrun by coalition armies for those inland. Apart from the French Empire's client states in the Batavian Republic, Swiss Confederation, and the Kingdom of Italy, France had a reluctant ally in Spain, and 3 German allies, the Duchies of Bavaria, Stuttgart-Württemberg, and Baden. With little chance of inviting more allies to his side, Napoleon instead limited his goal to gaining promises of neutrality from potential coalition members. Effusive with praise to the Sublime Porte, Napoleon managed to convince the Ottoman Sultan Selim III to keep the coalition at arm's length, and not ally with their great rival, Russia. So too was King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia convinced, as the deal to transfer Hanover in exchange for neutrality was finalised. Implied, of course, behind these diplomatic plays was the threat of French military reprisal. It was enough to keep some of the smaller German and Italian states down, including Naples. The Bourbon rulers of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies were inclined to join an anti-French coalition, and heavily put upon by the British, who relied upon southern Italy for their naval strategy in the Mediterranean. But as Napoleon warned King Ferdinand IV, French armies had twice before overrun Naples. At Amiens, Napoleon restored Ferdinand, and he assured him that he would not be so generous a second time. Though they vacillated between London and Paris, Naples signed a treaty of neutrality in September 1805. The treaty was to prove short-lived. Though Britain's attempts to woo allies had far more success, ultimately, the Third Coalition's chances hinged on Austrian involvement. Sweden and Naples would require intensive Royal Navy support to pose a credible threat to France. Prussia was busy chewing on a Hanover-shaped steak and wouldn't risk biting the hand that fed them. And though Russia fielded huge armies, hundreds of miles separated them from the fight. Only Austria had both the proximity and capacity to be a serious challenge to the French Empire. What's more, Austria had the willingness. Brought to his knees twice before, Emperor Francis II had more reason than most to want to see Napoleon cut down a peg. Independently of Britain, Francis had heeded the advice of his more bellicose advisors and planned for a renewed war with France. Only the Emperor's brother Charles and a few diehards countenanced against war, correctly assessing that without serious reforms, the Austrian army and economy would buckle in another contest with France. Then again, if ever there was a time for the Austrians to attack, it was now, with British gold clinking in their pockets and Russian armies at their back. Napoleon was kept apace with the developing situation in Vienna by his ambassador there, Louis-Guillaume Otto. The news concerned him deeply because war with Austria would derail plans to invade England. Though in hindsight we can say the plan wasn't watertight, Napoleon was still intent on following through, even as late as mid-1805. To buy time, Foreign Minister Maurice de Talleyrand worked with the Austrian ambassador to Paris, Ludwig von Kebenzl, to try and hash out a last-minute compromise with Austria. But events at sea definitively scuppered Napoleon's invasion plans. The overcomplicated and ambitious plan to outsail the Royal Navy nearly came to fruition as Admiral Charles Villeneuve hoodwinked the Royal Navy. But the loss of 2 ships at the Battle of Cap Finisterre on July 23rd forced him to return to port. Blockaded down in Ferrol by August 10th, the jig was up. The entire French fleet was blockaded in Brest, Ferrol, Toulon, and Rochefort. At around the same time, Austria joined the Third Coalition, making open preparations for war. Though Napoleon was furious, haranguing the Austrians for their violation of the peace, there was no changing the undeniable fact that his planned invasion of England was a bust. On August 25th, Otto warned that the Austrian invasion was imminent. Days later, Napoleon remarked, quote, "The news from Italy points to war, and Austria is barely keeping up appearances." A great deal of ink had already been spilt over in Vienna planning their 1805 campaign. The Aulic Council's strategy took cues from 1796 and 1800, namely that Napoleon would lead the French army personally and make his main effort in Italy. Therefore, it would be on the plains of northern Italy that the Austrians intended to achieve their decisive victory. Despite his reticence about the war, Archduke Charles, as by far and away the finest Austrian general, took command of this army of Italy. Reinforced to 96,000 troops, it was the largest and most formidable Austrian army put to the field in recent memory. Its deficiencies in material and training were made up for by experience, as the veterans of prior campaigns against the French led the army. With Italy as the primary theatre, a secondary theatre was to be opened up against the French via the Rhineland frontier. Archduke Ferdinand was given command of 70,000 troops stationed at the Danube. With no real military experience to speak of, effective command of the army of the Danube was to be held by Karl Mack von Leiberich. Mack was no genius, and his prior record of service in the French Revolutionary Wars was poor. He was given his posting essentially as a political favour. Mack was one of the most vocal pro-war voices in Vienna, so the Aulic Council trusted him to see through their invasion plan. Between Charles and Ferdinand sat a third army, the Army of the Tyrol. At 23,000 strong, Archduke John's command was not expected to engage directly with any enemy armies, but rather keep lines of communication open across the Alps. If need be, they could block any attempt to invade Tyrol via Switzerland. Far to the east were the three Russian field armies marching to the front, numbering 100,000 all told. This number would be enough to turn the tide of the coming campaign, but so far the Russian march had been delayed by snow as they crossed the Carpathians into Hungary. Once they arrived, however, the idea was to have the three Russian armies support the push into Germany. The campaign would open with Ferdinand invading Bavaria, Napoleon's ally, to quell any resistance from the electors. At the same time, Charles would commence his invasion of Italy by crossing the Adige, ideally overwhelming any resistance. With Bavaria taken, Ferdinand would then cover the approach of the Russian armies, which the Tsar promised would arrive by October 20th at the latest. The largest Russian army, under Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, would join Ferdinand in Bavaria with 35,000 troops. Friedrich Wilhelm von Buxtehude would not be far behind with an army of 40,000. A third army under Marshal August von Benningsen would take position in Bohemia. Once arrayed, Ferdinand would sweep through Swabia and Franconia. Command would then be transferred to Emperor Francis himself, who would lead the attack across the Rhine. Benningsen would remain behind to cover the northern flank with Prussia. Diplomatic updates from Otto and reports from Joseph Fouché's spies kept Napoleon well apprised of the coalition troop build-up, but they were hardly the only concern facing the emperor. He returned to Paris from Boulogne on September 1st to confer with the Senate. Anticipating casualties from the coming campaign, Napoleon demanded the Senate approve the calling up of 1806's levy of 80,000 recruits 1 year early. It's telling that though the Senate was stuffed with Napoleonic appointees and allies, all balked at the demand, compelling Napoleon to force the levy with a senatus consultum. Their reasons for opposing were fiscal in origin. Already, the French financial sector was in dire straits, the result of intensive lending to support the war effort and the strain imposed by the British blockade of goods to and from French markets. When Napoleon called for the levy, it triggered a bank run as rumours spread that the emperor had raided the treasury of the Bank of France to pay for the campaign. Parisian authorities dispersed the crowds before nightfall, but faith in the franc remained badly shaken. A contagious sense of pessimism pervaded the general public and political establishment. Sensitive to this sentiment, Napoleon did his best to restore faith in French credit. Through François Barbé Marbois, the Minister of Finance, Napoleon reassured financiers that, quote, all matters go favourably. In spite of these promises, or perhaps because of them, pessimism remained. At this stage, the abandonment of the invasion of England was not common knowledge, and as far as the public was aware, Napoleon still intended to invade England while Austria invaded from the east. These fears went into overdrive when, by late evening on September 2nd, reports reached Paris that Mack had commenced his invasion. Crossing the Danube into Bavaria, the electors' armies withdrew rather than be crushed. Munich fell, then the fortified city of Ulm. Within days, all of Bavaria was occupied. Through the use of a highly sophisticated series of semaphore signaling towers stretching from Strasbourg back to Paris, Napoleon was aware of the invasion at least a few hours before the general public. He appears to have recognized that he'd underestimated Austrian tenacity. "I did not suppose the Austrians would be so active," he confided to Talleyrand, "but I have made so many mistakes in my life, I am past blushing for them." Though it would have made excellent sense to end fretting about the two-front war from a public relations point of view, Napoleon instead took the opportunity to shroud his operations in secrecy. Invasion rhetoric was doubled down, and no indication given that the invasion was cancelled. Talleyrand too was instructed to ham up France's apparent weakness in order to buy 20 days in which the French could prepare. Fouché's blackout on information covered the first maneuvers of troops away from the coast. The French achieved complete surprise. Reports on the crisis in Paris convinced Vienna they'd seize the initiative, lulling the Austrians into a false sense of security. It gave Napoleon the time he needed to plan his response. Most of this planning took place at the War Ministries at the Tuileries. Mac's invasion, though anticipated, meant the planning phase had to be seriously condensed. At the same time, with the stakes this high, the plan had to be essentially foolproof. But if anyone was up to the challenge, it was Napoleon and his staff. The first great hurdle was to get the 210,000 soldiers of La Grande Armée down from their various camps and barracks along the French coast and all the way down to the Rhineland frontier. Here Napoleon was joined by Henri Clark, his older boss from the Topographic Bureau. Huge maps, updated by Jean-Marie Savary, were splayed upon tables or across the floor as Napoleon and Clark devised extremely precise marching orders for all 7 corps. As the Emperor crawled along the floor, measuring distances with forceps, his focus was such that he was known to bang into Clark's head. For the campaign itself, Napoleon relied upon detailed reports from his officers in the field. Joachim Murat and Henri Bertrand personally scouted the regions of southern Germany where the campaign would take place. Status updates on Russian and Austrian movements were also provided by a legion of informants in the service of Talleyrand and Fouché. Pierre Bruneau, the Minister of War, absorbed Napoleon's dictation for the campaign, which he delivered in a stream of consciousness. Of course, all this planning produced a huge amount of administrative strain for Napoleon's staff and the War Ministry. Hundreds of orders had to be dispatched to hundreds of officers, and all sent at the exact right time so as not to compromise operational security. Chief of Staff Louis-Alexandre Berthier had by now created an extremely efficient filing system for this staff work, and was able to condense it all down to fit on a single carriage. The first of the marching orders were transmitted on August 26th. By September 23rd, the 7 corps of La Grande Armée were arrayed along the Rhine in a 200-mile front, from the city of Hanover in the north to Strasbourg in the south. First Corps was commanded by Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. Bernadotte was known less for his military exploits than for his diplomatic ones, and Napoleon trusted in to liaise with the 2 Bavarian divisions, one under Bernhard Erasmus von der Rohe and another under Karl Philipp von Wrede. Alongside Bernadotte was Marshal Auguste Marmont. Marmont was Napoleon's chief of artillery, ultimately in charge of training and fielding the Grande Armée's thousands of pieces of cannon. On campaign, he would lead the artillery reserve, redesignated as 2nd Corps. Together, 1st and 2nd Corps would form the left wing of the Grande Armée. The centre would be comprised of 3rd and 4th Corps. 3rd Corps was commanded by Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, a commander of proven talent but without any serious exploits to his name. This would be Davout's first real independent command, and one to which he was to prove worthy. To Davout's south was 4th Corps under Jean Soult. Brave and iron-willed, Soult was primarily responsible for the Grande Armée's excellent training. Under his exacting regimes at Boulogne, each division conducted exercises every 2 weeks, and an entire corps every 4. Napoleon trusted Soult to drive his corps hard in the decisive push toward Franconia. At the southern end of the French Rhine, closest to Strasbourg, were 5th and 6th Corps, forming together the right wing of the Grande Armée. Smack dab in the middle was Marshal Michel Ney. Best known as a brilliant cavalry officer, command of a corps was a big promotion for Napoleon to hand out, especially to someone with whom he'd never served directly. But such was Ney's reputation for dash and bravery that Napoleon entrusted him with 6th Corps for the drive on Ulm. To cover Ney was someone with whom Napoleon had served before and trusted completely, Jean Lannes, commanding 5th Corps. Attached to the right wing was Marshal Joachim Murat. Vying with Ney for the honour of being France's greatest cavalry leader, Murat led the Grande Armée's colossal reserve of cavalry. Having personally scouted much of southern Germany, Murat would be entrusted with screening and pursuit. Once all 6 corps of the army were across and pushing deep into Germany, Pierre Augereau's 7th Corps would reinforce the centre and right, serving as a strategic reserve and a backstop in case things went tits up. With anticipation, the 7 marshals of La Grande Armée received their orders by late September. For security purposes, details about a corps' individual movements were kept compartmentalized, as if the Austrians caught even the faintest glimpse that Germany would be the focus of Napoleon's intentions, not Italy, it could spell disaster. Rather than wait for the enemy to invade, the Emperor's plan was characteristically bold. He intended to attack first, seizing the initiative. Summarizing the strategy in a letter, Napoleon stated that he would, quote, "get to the heart of Germany with 300,000 men before anyone even suspects it." With Mack invested in southern Germany, the Grande Armée would perform a manœuvre sur le derrière, or an attack to the rear, on a massive scale. The left wing would descend from the north to rendezvous at Würzburg with the Bavarian divisions. Simultaneously, Murat would launch extensive diversionary attacks through the Schwarzwald as far as the river Neckar. This would, hopefully, lull Mack into believing the main French assault was coming directly across the Rhine from the west. Reinforcing his west would leave Austrian forces north of the forest vulnerable, as the full might of the centre blasted through in the direction of Halle. To the centre's south, the right wing would ford the Rhine and drive directly east, avoiding pitched battle. After a few days of hard marching, the corps would be north of Ulm, putting Mack in an impossible bind. If held, Ulm would be encircled, but if he ran, the Danube would be wide open. With Mack defeated, it would be the turn of Kutuzov and the Russians. They could either give battle and be destroyed, or retreat. Either way, the Danube frontier would be exposed, giving Napoleon the chance to take Vienna before the end of the year. Napoleon's offensive had to be completed quickly, before the Russians arrived, before winter set in, and before the public's faith in his leadership waned. Given this need to end the campaign quickly, speed, uncompromising and sustained, would be absolutely vital to success. No delay, no matter how minor, could be tolerated, as every day wasted was a day Kutuzov drew nearer to his juncture. There was also the problem of the peripheral fronts. Down in Italy, the secondary theatre, the Archduke Charles would pose an immense threat to France itself. His attack into northern Italy would be occurring at the same time as Napoleon's. So to block a potential invasion of Provence, Napoleon reinforced the army of Italy up to 50,000 troops, and gave command to one of his best independent commanders, Marshal André Massena. Massena's job was not to win per se, but rather to bog down and delay Charles with local counterattacks. Another Italian army under Laurent Guavron de Saint-Cyr would be stationed further south at the border with Naples. If Naples reneged on their neutrality, Saint-Cyr was in a position to capture the kingdom and prevent the British from gaining an easy foothold in southern Italy. Back up in Germany, Sweden and Britain would pose a threat too, but not a serious one. Napoleon figured the Swedish army wasn't in great shape, and the British would be unwilling to land troops directly. Erring on the side of caution, however, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, in command of 1st Corps, would swing wide and up to the north, menacing the Swedes and Wolgast into staying out of Germany. Once the campaign began, almost all of France's military strength would be deployed, theoretically leaving France itself vulnerable to invasion. Britain had made descents on isolated French islands and ports along the northern coast, and it wasn't inconceivable, however unlikely, that a British force might invade. Napoleon didn't think this likely, but just to be safe, he left Guillaume Bonne behind in Boulogne with 30,000 troops. Napoleon departed Saint-Cloud on the 24th of September, vowing not to return to Paris until he had, quote, touched his goal. The next day he was in Nancy, and by the 26th he was at army headquarters at Strasbourg. By the time Napoleon arrived, the campaign was already 2 days in. The first French troops across the Rhine on the morning of the 24th were dragoons of General Baraguer-Dillier's division. After only a few hours, they'd captured the town of Freudenstadt. Close behind was most of the rest of Murat's division, which rummaged through the narrow defiles of the Schwarzwald, harrying the Austrian pickets. The army corps then began their attack. After sending an emissary to the Duke of Württemberg requesting passage, Ney's 6th Corps crossed the Rhine at Karlsruhe and wasted no time in marching east. Lannes' 5th Corps was not far behind, having raced north up to Rastatt from their crossing. By October 2nd, Ney and Lannes were in Stuttgart, ready to deflect any counterattack. In parallel to the right wing's advance, The flying columns of the centre raced east. Their pace was excellent. Most divisions covered an average of 30 kilometers a day. By October 3rd, Soult's 4th Corps was in Halle with Davout's 3rd Corps a few hours' march north. The left wing of Bernadotte's 1st Corps and Marmont's 2nd Corps had likewise made easy progress. Marmont followed the Main River to Würzburg. Bernadotte joined him there on the 2nd. As expected, the 2 Bavarian divisions were awaiting, ready for orders. Progress for all the French corps had been beyond expectations. The campaign had kicked off without a hitch, and even the weather seemed on France's side. Napoleon remarked that it was a fine autumn. As the troops bivouacked on the night of September 30th, their officers read out the day's dispatch written by the Emperor. "Soldiers, the war of the Third Coalition has begun. The Austrian army has crossed the river Aisne, has broken all treaties, has attacked our ally Bavaria, and driven him from his capital. You have been compelled to rush to the defence of our frontiers by forced marches, but you are already across the Rhine. We will not cease our march until we secure the independence of the German states, restore our allies, and confound the pride of our unjust aggressors." In keeping with the spirit of this address, the next day, October 1st, Napoleon reconfirmed his ties to the German duchies. He arrived in Ettingen for a brief chinwag with Karl Friedrich, the Duke of Baden, and the day after was in Ludwigsburg, where he treated with Duke Friedrich of Württemberg. Both dukes agreed to make their armies available, and they guarded the lines of supply and communication back to Strasbourg. Reports from the advancing corps continued to flood in as Napoleon was in Ludwigsburg. The Austrians had clearly been taken completely by surprise. Confusion reigned in the Austrian camp as a stupefied General Mack failed to issue even a single order to counterattack, making himself easy prey. Napoleon was not in the habit of interrupting his enemy while they were making a mistake, so with the initiative still his, the Grande Armée began the second stage of their advance to Ulm's north. The right and centre marched east out of Stuttgart towards Nördlingen, about 80 kilometers northeast of Ulm. The left wing pivoted southwards and advanced towards Donauwörth. The left's eastern flank was covered by the Bavarian divisions, operating out of Ansbach. Ansbach itself was territory of the Hohenzollerns of Prussia, and by passing through unannounced, the French had just violated Prussian territory. This seemingly minor diplomatic incident was to have far-reaching ramifications soon enough. In what was now the second stage of the offensive, the French began to face their first real challenges. Enemy actions had been limited to a few minor skirmishes with outlying units. The real problem was that on the 3rd, the relatively warm autumn weather broke, giving way to frigid, near-constant snow and rain. To complicate things, supplies were running low. One of the compromises made to speed up the advance was that the corps carried only 4 days' worth of food with them, saving their last reserves of biscuits for use only on Napoleon's order, which he'd give on the eve of a major battle. Given the precision of the marching orders, this lack of food had been factored in. Each corps' advance was given separate regions in which to forage, and they'd only have to march for half a day at a time, leaving the afternoon for foraging. Problem was that as food ran low, more time had to be spent foraging. The brunt fell on local villagers as winter stores of potatoes and grain were emptied en masse to feed the hungry French soldiers. These problems did not impede the progress of the corps too much, however, and they still made an excellent pace. By October 6th, all the corps had arrived at their objectives, cold and hungry, but ready to fight. Despite now occupying a perilous position, Mack still had options. He could retreat south into the Alps and link up with the army of the Tyrol. However, this would be surrendering Germany to Napoleon and leave the Russian armies vulnerable. Archduke Ferdinand, despite not having a lick of serious military experience, quite rightly argued that an immediate counterattack was necessary. But in the odd arrangement dreamt up by the Aulic Council, Mack, even though technically subordinate to Ferdinand, could countermand his orders. In the event, Mack made no counterattacks, but nor did he try to escape. Instead, he was convinced that the defences east of Ulm, around Elchingen, would delay the French until the Russians bailed him out. If Mack was going to stay put, Napoleon was fine with it. The trick now would be to close the trap by crossing the Danube and cutting off all escape routes back to Vienna. On October 7th, the Grande Armée barreled south, fording the Danube on a 160-kilometre front. Augsburg was taken by Soult's corps on the 9th. Napoleon was not far behind, travelling from Bamberg to Donauwörth on the army's trail. Even with battle still raging as Soult's men fought Austrian grenadiers street to street, Napoleon established Augsburg as the new centre of operations. The city would also serve as the new central position from where he'd base his forces. Bernadotte and Davout's corps were sent east to liberate Munich and block any relief attempt by the Russians. Marmont and his artillery, along with the Imperial Guard, were kept in reserve at Augsburg. But the main event was still Ulm. Soul's 4th Corps swept south to Landsberg and then Memmingen, decisively cutting off any chance of a Tyrolean exit by October 13th. His orders read, quote, "Allow no halts, move day and night. The least you can send me is 3,000 or 4,000 prisoners." At the same time, Landskorps made the direct push on Ulm from the east, supported by elements from Murat's cavalry division. Hemming Mack in from the north and west was Ney's corps and elements of Augereau's. No corps was more than 2 days from each other, and with his central position in Augsburg, Napoleon was easily able to keep a pace with developments from the front lines, sending reinforcements where needed. The Emperor expected a counterattack on Augsburg at any time. Why wouldn't he? If in the same position as Mack, he'd order an immediate breakout attempt. But no attack ever materialized. The Austrians instead remained dug in and inactive as the Grande Armée closed the trap. It was from the headquarters in Augsburg that Napoleon found the time, between a deluge of orders sent and reports received, to write back to the Empress Josephine, who'd stayed behind in Strasbourg. So too did the Emperor finish up the last of no less than 37 articles written for the army newspaper. In these articles, he lauded the bravery and élan of the troops, and gave a concise overview of the army's movements. Praise was lavished on several regiments, including 2 regiments of dragoons, the 4th and the 9th, who formed the tip of the spear. Of all the things Napoleon had to worry about, the army's morale was not one of them. They'd marched into Germany singing La Marseillaise, and though these chants had died down amid snow and hunger, desertion rates were negligible. In fact, lower than they had been at camp at Boulogne. By comparison, the Austrian troops melted like wet paper. Reflecting on the performance of his troops, Napoleon wrote, quote, "Our worst regiments of hussars attack heavy cuirassier regiments, with all odds against them, but rout the enemy. The infantry makes no stand whatsoever." No harm could be done by ending the fighting sooner rather than later, however, and on the 11th, the French advance resumed. The first serious Austrian resistance had been encountered by Lannes and Murat 3 days before at Wertingen. A battalion of French dragoons collided with the better part of an Austrian division. Throughout the day, French reinforcements were called up and turned the tide, annihilating the Austrian force. A weak Austrian breakout attempting the direction of Günzburg was knocked back on the 9th. On the 11th, Napoleon transferred effective command of the 3 corps surrounding Ulm to Murat, along with the advice to keep his forces concentrated, lest at the last minute, Mack grow a spine and attack. There wasn't much of a chance of that. Mack, can you believe it, was under the delusional belief that the French were on the retreat as the British had invaded. But Murat was not to know, and had to presume the Austrians, still numbering some 50,000, were a major threat. Heeding Napoleon's advice to fight concentrated, he ordered Ney to ford the Danube and join him for the final assault on Ulm. Having expected this order, Ney had already ordered his divisions across, mostly at Dillingen, on October 9th. Now on the 11th, only Pierre Dupont's division and Bareguet-Dillier's dragoons remained on the northern bank. It was here that they were set upon by 2 divisions of Austrian troops, 25,000 men, fully half of Mack's force, and all of his cavalry. His back to the Danube and escape cut off, Dupont might reasonably have been expected to fight for a while before eventually being surrounded and then surrendering. But there was a chance to escape if the enemy could be held off until nightfall, now only a few hours away. So at Haslach, Dupont's division attacked into the teeth of the Austrian line, entirely unsupported. The French prevailed, ejecting the enemy from Haslach and all the way back to Ulm. Disaster had only narrowly been avoided by Dupont's aggression. Ney and Murat butted heads over who was to blame. There would be fallout for Murat, but in the short term, the battle at Haslach was an incredible boon. It turns out that the reason half the Austrian army had been probing along the Danube was in search of an escape route. Finally, Mack's belated breakout was at hand. However, as the demoralized Austrian troops flooded back into Ulm, Mack believed his officers' reports that Dupont's division, maybe 4,000 men, was in fact most of Ney's corps. How else could the tenacity of their attack be explained? Whatever hope for deliverance was now denied to Mack. Kutuzov was still 180 kilometers away in Bohemia, and the Austrian army was unwilling to fight. All that was left was to await the inevitable. The inevitable came on the 14th of September. Napoleon was taken by surprise at Mack's probe, as he had expected him to fight his way out via the south down the river Ille. However, Haslak showed Mack's concentration to be northern facing. So on the fly, Napoleon upended his plans to complete the encirclement by racing west. Instead, all available forces, including the reserve, were dispatched for a final attack on Ulm. This sudden shift in direction caused significant problems for the advancing corps, which had to pivot to face north on extremely short notice. Roads were backed up for dozens of miles as the combat troops retraced their steps, running into compacted lines of supply wagons and civilian traffic. Rain, turning the ground to mud, hindered the advance too. Food stores ran low, and as Napoleon raced to the new front, he encountered soldiers firing their muskets not at enemy troops, but at game that wandered about in the fields and forests. Where he was seen, however, the Emperor's presence restored some semblance of discipline. To the east of Ulm, most of Ney's corps and Murat's cavalry spent the morning of the 14th trying to find a viable crossing. Dillingen was too far from Dupont's division, so the one at Elchingen was chosen. But expecting a French relief attempt from the south, the bridge had been mostly demolished, and 9,000 troops put in defence. French cannons thundered overhead as Ney's troops advanced. Under constant Austrian fire, they repaired the bridge. Columns of cavalry and grenadiers then made an assault across the bridge, securing the embankment. Napoleon could have happily waited out the fighting from south of the Danube, but impatient for victory, he joined the later waves of the assault, braving every shot his troops did. The story goes that during an assault on Elchingen itself, Napoleon spied one veteran from Egypt whom he recognized. Even wounded, the veteran was urging the men onwards. At this, the emperor gave him his cloak and said, quote, "Bring it back to me, and I will give you the pension you well deserve." A few hours later, Elchingen was captured, and Napoleon reunited with his cloak. A counterattack was launched from the northwest, but Dupont's division once again defied the odds, fending off the attack. By day's end, the entirety of Ney's and Murat's forces were across the Danube, with Ulm in full sight. Marmont and the Guards stayed put on the southern side and bombarded Ulm from across the river. Seeing the writing on the wall, Ferdinand quit Ulm with 6,000 horsemen, all that remained of the cavalry force. They made a break for it, hoping to reach an Austrian division further north. Murat's cavalry set off in pursuit, intercepting them on the road. Throughout the night of the 14th and the morning of the 15th, French cavalry harried and hounded their Austrian counterparts with unmatched endurance, leaving only a few hundred stragglers, including Ferdinand, to limp into Heidenheim. Ney, in the meantime, had conducted the assault on Ulm itself. The heights of Mikkelsburg, centering on a small church, were occupied by a few thousand Austrians. On the 15th, Ney seized the heights and began a bombardment of Ulm. The next day, he received a puzzling offer from Mack. The Austrian commander agreed to surrender if, in fact, the Russians hadn't arrived in 3 weeks. This frankly ridiculous offer was laughed at and then duly forwarded to Napoleon. Philippe Paul de Ségur, a member of his staff, was sent to negotiate. He haggled Mack down to a surrender by the 25th. When returning to Napoleon, Ségur found him in Haslach, sleeping in a barn. He was resting almost shoulder to shoulder with one of the regimental drummers. It's a little anecdote that does much to humanize Napoleon, and explain why the little corporal was so beloved by his soldiers. Just like in Italy, he willingly shared the hardships of soldiering, for as much as a doze in a warm barn can be counted as hardship. A few days of waiting wasn't too arduous. Mack wasn't going anywhere. Most of the action from the 17th to the 20th consisted of Murat running rampant to the north. His cavalry overran 2 entire Austrian divisions, a total of 20,000 soldiers. News of these disasters reached Mack and hit him like a ton of bricks. The battle was over. Defeat was inevitable. Days of rain ended on the afternoon of the 20th of October. Arrayed on the fields before Ulm, Ney's corps surveyed the Austrian army as they surrendered. 25,000 soldiers and 2,000 cavalry deposited their arms in great piles, and though badly beaten, they marched past in good order, destined for prisoner of war camps in France. Emperor Napoleon II watched this display from atop the heights of Mikkelsburg. The Austrian officers, Mack included, ascended the heights to meet their vanquisher. Ségur noted that as Mack approached, a French officer who did not recognize him asked him who he was. The Austrian commander replied, quote, "I am the unfortunate Mack." The unfortunate Mack surrendered his sword and his command to Napoleon. One of the Austrians was curious. Why did an emperor wear a soldier's uniform speckled with mud? Napoleon replied, half jokingly, quote, Because I am a soldier, a fact which your emperor wished to remind me of. I trust he now knows that though I have taken the purple, I have not forgotten my trade. The Ulm campaign thus came to a close after 26 days. It was a victory of truly stupendous scale. Mack and Ferdinand's entire command was annihilated, 60,000 troops in all. Augereau added 10,000 to this number when he caught a division of Austrians fleeing from Ulm at the Battle of Kempten. At Heidenheim, Murat had taken the entire Austrian artillery park of around 200 guns and captured 500 wagons, which were eagerly pressed into service by the Grande Armée. This is not to mention the hundreds of tons of powder, food and supplies captured from depots. Napoleon personally witnessed the surrender of 80 standards dumped on the grass before Mikkelsburg. Beyond the scale of the victory, the very nature of the campaign was itself something essentially unprecedented. This was a campaign won by operational maneuver. The soldiers joked that, quote, the emperor has used our legs as weapons. Napoleon's grand-scale manoeuvre sur le derrière not only outflanked the Austrians, but in so doing forced them into a series of equally bad options. Mack hadn't exactly acquitted himself well, to be fair, and at various points a better general could probably have cut his way out of the web. But having expected such a breakout, Napoleon had marched dispersed and fought concentrated, the essence of operational maneuver to this day. So even if a better general, say Charles, were in command, the outcome would have probably been harder fought, but essentially the same. This offensive capacity was the result of the Corps system, which had been so completely vindicated here in 1805 that it informed the next 2 centuries of military theory. Speed, as anticipated, had played the decisive role. When coupled with excellent drilling and stratospheric morale, the Grande Armée, in their debut campaign, had proven superior to the old guard Austrians. Jean Rapp and Ségur, both of the emperor's staff, recalled that Napoleon could barely contain his excitement. Hints of this elation suffused letters back to Josephine. From October 12th, the Austrians are beaten and don't know what to do. It all appears like the most successful, the shortest and most brilliant campaign ever fought. Another from the 20th reads, I have accomplished my object. I have destroyed the Austrian army simply by marching. I have made 60,000 prisoners, taken 120 guns, some 90 flags, and more than 30 generals. I am on the verge of marching on the Russians. They will be ruined. My army has distinguished itself. I've lost 1,500 men, of whom 2/3 are lightly wounded. Farewell, my dear Josephine. 1,000 warm wishes. It is perhaps a twist of irony, then, that on the very day of Napoleon's greatest triumph thus far, he was dealt one of his most painful defeats. The details would emerge slowly over the next few days, but it soon became unavoidable that the French had suffered a total naval defeat. The combined strength of the Franco-Spanish fleet had been beaten off the coast of Cadiz, not far from Cape Trafalgar. Horatio Nelson's victory was complete. Captured or sent to the bottom was 2/3 of the French and Spanish fleet, along with any invasion threat they posed to the British mainland. In the midst of the fighting, however, Nelson himself had been killed, shot through by a musket ball that deflected off his humerus. A definite downer was placed on Napoleon's elation about Ulm, which failed to outshine the disaster at Trafalgar. Felt too was the menacing presence of a pan-European coalition, which even so crushing a victory as Ulm could not dissuade. Charles and Massena clashed in Italy, Kutuzov drew nearer, and Britain ruled the waves. The 1805 campaign had opened flawlessly, but there was still a long way to go before Austria was out of the fight, the campaign's ultimate objective. Everything would again come down to a toss of the iron dice, and a battle fought upon the heights at Austerlitz.